All right. Hey, what's up?
Yo.
This is Ashkahn.
And it's Graham over here. And
What's
today,
our question?
Boy, am I glad you asked. It is kind of a long one, actually. So it's my question is in reference to DSP 107, which I don't know. That's what we call it on iTunes now. We abbreviate it as DSP.
Oh, this first question based off another question. I like this.
So we're for DSP 107, which for those of you not in the know means Daily Solutions Podcast episode number 107.
Yeah, it's a classic one.
I am slowly best of hits right there. I'm slowly working towards starting a float center, but my time frame is roughly 1 year out. Well, that sounds ambitious. It's probably more like 2 years, first of all. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I was wondering if you guys have any advice/guidelines about starting with one tank in your home. I've heard you guys mention this a few times here and there. What kind of guidelines would I need to abide by if I was to charge money? Would I have to treat it just like it was a multiple tank business? Anything helps. Thanks for everything.
All right, the old tankaroony in your house.
So
yeah, we have talked about this before because we often mention it as a nice kind of stepping stone in the process of opening a float center. Like as you're on your path towards figuring things out and finding a location and all that sort of stuff, it can be nice to get a float tank, put it in your house, and just start to get a feel for what it's like, what the cleaning's like, what the maintenance is like, how much of, your house is going to be destroyed by salt. Like it just helps you like get a good sense for what dealing with a float tank is like. And you get to float and you get to like get your friends to come float and you get to kind of start spreading the word on floating by having people actually get to experience it. So there's kind of all these benefits like that of having a float tank that you can start out with in your home. But there are some questions like this person is asking that kind of need to go along with that concept.
What does it involve? How do I do it? Am I breaking the law?
Let's start with that, like the breaking the law.
Hold on.
Oh, no.
breaking the law. Let's not talk about that on air. Yeah. No, so there's a couple other benefits to having a float tank in your home that I think too. Just before we go on to the how, more of the why, which is especially if you are going to open up a bigger center, like a 4 or 5 tank center. The idea of having one that you actually get to play around with and test for even a few months or a year before you make that final purchase of a bunch of units is kind of nice. Like you might find that you actually don't enjoy how that, like the float that tank provides or how easy it is to take care of behind the scenes or something like that. And if you do like it, you can just put that float tank immediately into your business, which is nice. It's not like you then have this home tank that you need to use for your home and you're still going to be buying 5 extra float tanks for your center. You can reuse it, or again, if you find out that you might want a different type of float tank, you can resell the one that you had in your home and invest in other float tanks that might be better for your center. So there's just a little like feeling it out and making sure that you ending up with a product that you want to stock in your full center.
Yeah, and it's pretty easy to sell float tanks used, which is nice.
Yeah, there's even a float website for it. Yeah. Usedfloattanks.com.
I wonder who runs that.
We'll find out one day.
So then so now we've convinced you.
Yeah, okay. So we're in
you want to put a float tank
in your house. You can move on to
house.
breaking the law.
So there's a jump between you floating and having your friends floating and charging people money to come to your house and float.
Yeah.
And that line is the law. And so
just like there's a line between, baking a casserole for you and your family and baking a casserole and serving it to strangers.
Yeah. And this is just going to be different from place to place. Different jurisdictions have different rules regarding home businesses and zoning and, everything that would be involved in that sort of thing. So you're going to have to do a little bit of research in your area. But most of the time, there's usually some sort of rules that would allow you to do this, above board. And get the proper permit and stuff like that to have something like this set up in your house.
And often often it involves going through the city and getting a permit to do it. It involves checking in with your neighbors very often, making sure that no one immediately around you has a problem with you running a business out of your home of a certain type. Often there's traffic restrictions, like you need to not have any more than a certain number of visitors a day or more than a certain number of cars kind of parked out front. Again, I think a lot of the laws around residential businesses revolve around making sure that no one that you're right next to is going to feel an impact from suddenly all these cars and people coming in and out and noise and things like that. So when I've looked into it in different areas, it almost always has this very strong element of checking in and just making sure that it's all right with the people around you.
And you may find now that kind of float tank regulations from place to place are getting a little bit more existent, or like now that kind of whole world is developing a little bit, there might be some places where you run into possibly bigger hurdles than other places. There are some regulations out there that require things like floor drains in your room. That's part of the necessity of opening up, that they actually have a rule for stuff like that. So you could find yourself in a position where it might not be as easy to put a float tank into your house if you do have to do some like actual construction or something to alter the room to meet the rules. You might be able to get kind of waivers and exemptions to stuff like that. But and it's probably not very many places where you'd run into that at the current moment. But, that could be something that might be in front of you.
Yep. And I guess that's a good point, too. Even without being a commercial business, you can still have a float tank in your house and float friends and relatives and yourself and get a lot of the benefits that we were even talking about early on about having a float tank in your house without being fully set up as a commercial business and even really letting money exchange hands or letting total strangers into float or anything like that. So really a lot of this stuff is related directly to once you decide that you want to accept money, especially if you're advertising anywhere, putting yourself out as a float business. Like all of these make it seem like you really are running something commercially out of your home as opposed to you just have a float tank that other people can get access to.
Yeah, and kind of what your setup is, I think, probably changes a little bit at the point you start charging money. Like if you're not charging money, it's a lot easier to, maybe there's a little bit of noise that gets in here or there, or you're just not quite fully set up to be accommodating to strangers. But at the point that you're kind of charging for a service, like I feel like you got to step your game up a little bit. Like you maybe do want to invest in some good like blackout curtains to really make sure there's no light leaks, and you probably want to make sure that the float tank is decently close to a bathroom with a shower in it, so people don't have to be like walking through your house with a towel just like
covered in salt. Yeah.
So there's just kind of a few more accommodations like that I think you need to figure out as you change from the floating your friends to floating kind of customers.
Yeah, and there does seem to be a difference, too, between people who do have a tank in their house as an interim and they're planning on developing into a center in the future versus people who actually are just setting up a full-on float tank center in their house, and that's where they want it to be. And maybe they'll expand to a center someday, but there are 2 and 3 tank centers that people are operating just out of their homes with a commercial residential license. And those I got on this track because I was thinking that very much is the case with them, especially, right? Like it's like a whole section of their house is almost set up like a business. Like you can go into a lot of these places that are home float tank centers and you'd barely even recognize them as a home for how they're set up.
And, depending on how long you're doing this, it kind of gets more serious the more you're thinking of this as a permanent installation. If you're thinking of this as a stepping stone, you maybe can get away with not having to worry as much about waterproofing and stuff like that. But if you're really seriously trying to put float tanks into your house and run it as a home float tank center, you're probably going to want to step your game up in terms of the waterproofing and what you're doing to protect the rooms, or you're just going to destroy your house. I mean, it's it's going to doubly suck. Your business and your home will be ruined simultaneously.
Yeah, there's no getting around it. I mean, the like if you're only having a float tank in there for a year and you're only doing scattered appointments, it's kind of like all that damage is stretched out a little bit over time. So you don't see as much just immediate destructive qualities of salt when something's in your home as opposed to in a commercial space, And,
I think it should be noted, too, that I think there's some nice things that come with having a float tank in your house. Like especially if you are using it as a stepping stone and you're kind of trying to get a feel. It's not just getting a feel for like the operations and maintenance and salt of the float tank center, but it's a really nice way to talk to people. When someone comes out of a float and you have one float tank and it's in your house, they very often will just like hang out with you for another like 30, 45 minutes, like sitting down on your couch and chatting. And that's a really great place to get feedback on what their experience was like, if they got cold or hot, or if they heard noises, or, you'll just get like a lot of those kind of great kind of one-on-one interactions with people as they're floating under your belt, which will be very informative, I think, going into opening a commercial space.
It's true. You just meet lots of cool people if you're running a float tank out of your house. Like maybe even more so, like as far as being able to sit down for just 40 minutes, And I guess this is true of one tank centers in general that aren't home-based. But if that's all you have is one customer and there's no one coming in after and it's just you there, like that's sort of your only responsibility is to hang out with them, which is pretty cool. So yeah, there are perks that even commercial centers don't get sometimes for running a smaller home-built float center.
I will say, if the other thing to consider, if you're getting a float tank and you're putting it in your house and you're starting to get to the point where you're having, multiple people come a day and they're customers and stuff like that, you should have a commercial float tank in your house, because they make home float tanks that have sanitation systems that are made for home use. But if you're at the point that you're doing a higher capacity thing, then you need to get a proper float tank for it. Or you just need to realize that you're using a home float tank, and you probably need to filter for like hours between people instead of the 15 minutes that people do in a commercial setting. But even that might not totally be enough to kind of be doing the commercial level of sanitation that people are doing in kind of brick and mortar float centers.
Yeah, kind of like as soon as you and your family are opening anything up to things that aren't you and your family, especially with sanitation concerns, there just becomes this added risk involved of like now strangers are getting into the tank and other strangers are getting in after them, and cross-contamination, I guess, just outside of people in your immediate sphere becomes a little more of a risk.
So yeah, you should consider that, that's kind of where the home use tank stops, is at the point that it's not just like you and your close friends and family using it for your own kind of recreational purpose.
Or whatever, yeah. All right. So yeah, hopefully that was a good. Let's see, did we miss any parts of this? Just kind of guidelines. Would I treat it like it's a multiple tank business? Anything helps. Thanks for everything. No, I think we got it.
Yeah, good. Nailed another one. All right. If you guys have any other questions you want to send us, especially if you reference, other episodes like DSP.
Makes us feel very official.
It's nice.
Very important, yeah.
Go over to floattanksolutions.com/podcast. You can enter your questions there. And we'll talk to you tomorrow.
Bye.